Hey, Cindy.
Welcome back to another week of the Friday seminar. After last week, Peter first presented on bicycles. We are back to modeling for non-modelers. And we have Rick Donnelly here with us again. He started off the seminar, and he's here to talk about risk and uncertainty. Rick is the head of the modeling group at Parsons Brinckerhoff. And he's based out of Albuquerque, and we're happy to have him here on a nice day in Portland finally. So.
You bet. You ready? Mm-hmm. All right. So last time I was with you, I put to you this notion that we build models for a lot of reasons. And you're getting to see in this seminar some of the coolest models that people are working on right now. You're not seeing garden variety stuff. You are seeing kind of what's at the front end of modeling all around the world. And it's kind of exciting. And these models, some of them are built just merely for academic use, but most of them, they're put together and we put them out there so that we can use them to inform public policy analysis and investments. And when you have these really complex models, one thing that modelers never talk about, that I'm going to talk about today, is the risk and uncertainty of using them. Now, to be sure, when I talk about this, I'm going to give you some definitions and everything. I'm going to give you a fun example, or a fun example for me anyway, and kind of tell you about kind of the, what's going on in the big world and why this risk and uncertainty kind of creeps into these models. But what I'm talking about is the risk and uncertainty of using these models in decision making and making decisions based upon them. Many models, if you, I guess Ben gave the talk on activity-based models a couple of weeks ago, my colleague Ben Stabler, and in there we try to build models that incorporate uncertainty on the part of the decision maker when they're choosing between alternatives. I'm not talking about that stuff that's built into the model. I'm talking about, I'm going to use this model and I'm going to try to make some decisions based on it, and what are some of the problems associated with it. So, risk. Risk is real easy because it's a very crisp term, nice mathematical form. It is simply the probability of something occurring multiplied by the consequence of that occurrence. And really straightforward. And because most events in the world out there that occur, we have models or we have decisions about projects and everything. There are multiple risks, so sometimes we will put a summation there, and sometimes it might be a product sum. And the distinction comes down between how you calculate the cost of occurrence. For example, Katrina. The probability of your house being flattened by a combination of a flood and a hurricane is no greater than the combination of your house being flattened by a flood or a hurricane. Either one of them are adequate to destroy your home, and two of them together don't destroy two homes on your one property. So we normally look at risk as an additive sort of thing. Uncertainty, on the other hand, is kind of a fuzzy sort of thing, and it just is basically what we don't know about things. And it can be all kinds of things. There are things that are inherently uncertain because they just are that way in real life, like human relationships. You never really know where they're going to go, although you have in your mind a good idea of what's going on. But there are a lot of things that we don't have a lot of data about, because studying human behavior and capturing data on that is kind of hard. And there are a lot of things that we do have a lot of data about, like cell phone tracks, that we have yet to glean a lot of knowledge from. And then there's things that we do understand, but we don't agree on. We all have the data, and we all look at the data, but draw different conclusions. And there's perhaps no greater place to find that than I was telling you last time in climate change modeling, where you get a bunch of smart people all in a room exposed to the same data, and they come up with all these different conclusions based on what they're looking at. And so uncertainty is kind of a qualitative thing. Risk always involves uncertainty, but not the other way around. There are a lot of uncertain things in our future that don't involve a lot of risk. And so some examples in our realm, ding, some of the biggest risks in my experience, which is not the experience of everybody, but certainly mine, is that you have the wrong model. And the way this happens a lot is we build a certain kind of model, because all the models that you're going to see during this seminar, they take a lot of time and they take a lot of effort to put together. And once you put them together, people want to, use them for that particular use. And then the very next use, someone comes along and says, well, what about this? Or what about that? And you say, oh, well, my model was never designed to do that. And it turns out, say, well, The good news is you have the only model out there, and so therefore it is a great model to be used for this. So sometimes we use the wrong model to study what we're looking for. Or sometimes we have bad software. It turns out that most people that build these models, the people that, other than me that you're seeing here, they actually code the model themselves because they love doing that. It's some sort of a genetic defect. But the truth of the matter is that most people that are really brilliant model developers who are also gifted software developers is much smaller than the number of people that really are brilliant modelers and gifted software developers. And indeed, even if you get someone that's smart at software, when you build a complex model that has thousands of hours of person time in it and tens of thousands of lines of code, there's errors in it. And sometimes you find this out when you're trying to ferret out the outcomes of some of these models, despite your very best efforts to find them other ways. The other thing is that we kind of have a static mindset. We can think about the future in terms of our past and our present. But radically different futures are kind of difficult for us to imagine, as I will explain to you in just a moment an example of. There's a lot of disruptions in our society. A lot of them are good disruptions, but nonetheless they change the way that we do things and things that. And all of these things can happen, and they can influence how you use these models. And then there's all the uncertainties that even if there was no risk involved in using a model, what's the future going to look like? When's it going to get here? What's it going to look like when it does get here? Will we be able to believe the model if it tells us something that looks different from today? Do we have any basis for discovering whether that's real or not? And what kind of social changes and economic changes and everything else are all going on? All of these things are out there. So one problem we have one challenge that we have in modeling that is a big problem is because we have these big models, and they're elegant. There's no disputing that. These big models, they take a lot of time to run, and they have a voracious appetite for data. And so we generally run this thing through time, and we come out to some point in the future and say, aha, that's my forecast. So if we had enough burritos, tequila, and time, this group here, all of us together, we could come up with probably 10 views of the future that we could say, that's likely. And we could all buy into that. And more than likely, one of those outcomes or something close to it would be what really does happen in life. But if you just take one of these models and you run it through time and you come out to one future, the likelihood of that one future being the future that you wind up in is pretty doggone slender. And that's a risk of using models like this. So let me give you an interesting example here. This is kind of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And this is downtown Dallas here. And from downtown Dallas out here, there's this US Highway 75 called the Central Expressway. And it connects to the far suburbs in the northeast. And in fact, it goes all the way on to Tulsa. But the thing I want to focus on is this area right here from downtown Dallas out here to Interstate 635, the circumferential freeway here. This is what this thing looked like in 1985 when I started my very first forecasting project. And we were working on a forecast for 2010, which was just mind-boggling at the time. And US 75 at this time, Central Expressway, was 2 lanes in each direction. During the peak hour, it was congested beyond belief, and it had these suicide ramps where you had to really accelerate fast or decelerate fast in order to get on or off the freeway. And as a consequence, to travel from downtown out to Interstate 635, if you did it 2 in the morning, you could do it in 11 minutes. And if you happen to do it between 5 and 6 p.m. on an average workday, it'd take you about 40 minutes to make that very same trip. So when it was designed in 1950, after 30 years of controversy, it was a great freeway. But by 1985, the thing was completely broken down, and we rebuilt it. And it looks kind of like this now, which is kind of from the downtown looking north, where it has 4 lanes in each direction, so 8 total lanes. And we built these cantilevered frontage roads for the first 6 miles out of the downtown because we had to go through a really narrow urban canyon in order to slot this thing in. And, you know, by golly, it works. So one of the guys and I, that we were both working on this for the first time in our lives, we thought, we're going to collect data over time and see how well this thing turns out. And in 2010, we're going to go back and see if this thing actually turns out it all to look like what we thought it would. So this is travel times. So back before the construction, here's the interquartile range of some studies we did. And you're running about, almost a median value of 40 minutes to get from downtown out to Interstate 635. But there are some outliers in these data, and the top of it is up here, and I trimmed it off. Very volatile roadway. And after we worked it and got the thing open in 1999, the travel time dropped to about 14 minutes. That's no one else on the road. You can make it in 11. But with the road filled, you could do it in 14. And, and despite filling the capacity kind of on opening day. And it kind of stayed that way all the way through 2007. People got more familiar with the roadway and everything. And then we were thinking, we are ace geniuses. We nailed it. And indeed we should have, because it's a pipe. It's just a freeway. And as long as there's more congestion, wanting to get onto the freeway downtown than can get out the other end, you don't really need a graduate degree to figure out how many cars are going to emit out the other end of that pipe. But something strange happened in 2011. The travel time started going up again on this freeway. And in fact, the worst case we measured didn't look a whole lot different than the best case we measured before the freeway. Anyone want to guess what happened that caused this? That would be a good guess, but that's not right. Not billboards, no. So the engineer in me, being geek, says, okay, well, we must have more volume on this thing than we had before. And we're slowly creeping up to breakdown in flows. But that's not true either. Because we also measured the volume kind of midway between downtown and the outer loop. And we found that, it's carrying about 9,000 vehicles per hour headed north. So I don't have more volume on it. And then Tom and I finally figured out that this is what's going on with it. In 2007, we observed that 1 person out of 6 was talking on their cell phone when they were driving. But in 2011, after we started collecting these data, we started paying closer attention. We found out that 1 out of every 3 persons is talking on the freeway while they're commuting, which is smaller than the number of people that are talking on their cell phone, because a lot of them are using hand-free, and a lot of them are using earbuds or something else like that. And so there's a lot of people talking on their cell phone, and as a consequence, our flow is breaking down. Now, if you would have asked me in 1985 if I would have believed that everyone was going to have a cell phone, I'd have said, yeah, sure. I mean, in 1985 in Dallas, everybody had car phones because that was the big deal back then. And we had cell phones as well, but the handset was bigger than this. And it had a little antenna and everything else like that. And if you go by a video from the 80s, you can see what I mean. And I would have said, yeah, they would have it in 2010. And it would be no big deal. But I would also have told you that I would imagine in 2010, your car and your phone would be linked. And you'd have this heads-up display. And you would have no reduction in driver attention at all. And of course, as we found out with man-in-the-loop experience since then, is that while heads-up displays are great things for jet fighter pilots, they're almost as lethal as texting while driving for normal people. And so that outcome never occurred. We never anticipated this. Now, my point is, this is something that you should have been able to get right. And there weren't too many moving parts where you could be wrong about this forecast, and we still managed to get it wrong. So do you think this is a very common problem? Well, it turns out that there is a huge problem. And so here's some data from a Dutch economist who, he has trained me to say his name, and I still can't get it right, but it's something like Vlierig. And he wrote the definitive book on this, and I'm going to show you the book in a minute, or at least show you the name of the book in a minute, on risk and uncertainty associated with big infrastructure projects. But he went through, and he's the only person that walking around that can make this claim. He actually grabbed data from 210 projects where they looked at the forecasts that had been used to make a decision about an infrastructure project, and then went back and looked at the actual volume in the first year of the operation of the facility. And he chronicled this. And so most of these were roadway projects, 80 some odd of them. And so what I'm showing you here is the percent of how inaccurate they were. And these things up on top, these are the roadway projects that were looked at. And so these things over here, that's where we underbuilt, where the demand was much higher than the forecast. And over here is where the demand is much lower than the forecast, and we can pat ourselves on the back and say, you know, we didn't build any white elephants. We built a few things that we should have built much bigger than we did, but there may have been some constraints that prevented them from doing it. But the nice thing to notice about this is that this green line here, this is 0. And you see the mean is pretty close to 0, and it looks more or less normally distributed. And so if you didn't know anything about modeling, you might say, well, those guys, they ain't terribly accurate, but they're not that far off. You know, there's no systematic bias here. Well, down here on the bottom is rail projects. And there are 25 guys here and 2 outliers. And when you look at this, again, here's 0. And we find that on rail projects, we overestimate demand pretty handsomely. That the actual demand on transit projects, and most of his data are from Europe, I will say, turn out to have 40% less people on them than what was forecasted for opening day. And moreover, if you look at this, you can't escape the conclusion that we're systematically underestimating the volume on transit. I mean, if it was all over the board, you could say, you know, just modelers are worthless, you know, and they're no better than a random draw. But this is a pattern. And it turns out that we have a pattern in the US that was studied by a guy named Steve Pickerel, who in 1989 looked at all of our mass transit projects in the United States, and he came away with the same conclusion that these guys did in the Netherlands and said, well, we drastically underestimate costs and we drastically overestimate patronage on our transit systems. And I'm going to talk about what changed in the US. My point being, it hasn't really changed in Europe too much at all. And in fact, one of the most famous and the most widely studied projects in Europe is the Channel, the Channel Tunnel between the UK and the mainland. And so he's taken some of these data and he's normalized it. So here's total demand on the system, and here's the passenger demand, and here is the freight demand. And because he's normalized it, so the forecast is graded at 100 here. When the thing opened, in its first year, it got like 48% of what it was expected to open with in terms of demand. And you see that you have the same pattern with people, although it's kind of improved over time. You see the same pattern with freight. When it was partially completed, it had a lot less demand, but you would expect that. But the demand never hit. And in this case, a lot of people lost a lot of money because this was privately funded and everything, and it kind of went down the tubes. And the funny thing about this is that 4 or 5 people forecasted this, and they all agreed with the forecast. Even though they used different data, different approaches, different assumptions and everything, they all came up to the same thing, but it didn't quite turn out that way. So you get smart people, and you got brilliant models, you say, how could that possibly happen, right? Well, it turns out that there's a lot of reasons why it happens. And so I've tried to chronicle everything I can think of from my professional experience as to why these models go into orbit around Neptune. And the most common thing that goes wrong is that we make bad assumptions about the future, about land use, about the economy, and about social structure. We failed, for example, to anticipate the entry of women into the workforce in the 80s. And we failed to anticipate that it tapered off. We failed to anticipate when saturation and auto ownership rates would occur, things like that. And so these characteristics of the population, as well as where they put themselves in time and space, we get this all wrong a lot. And part of this is because it's driven by this second factor, which is kind of the political influence in everything. And when I'm saying political influence, I'm not talking about interference from politicians. What I'm talking about is through the body politic, we collectively put together transportation plans. We put together urban development plans. We have taxation and pricing policies. We have zoning. We have a lot of things that we put in place to shape our future, right? Well, those things become assumptions in my models when I build these models and I'm trying to look at the future. And so as a consequence, the politics get there. And our ambitions, like everything else in life, are often larger than what we actually execute. But when we decide as a matter of government policy that we're going to do something, then we expect to do it. And one thing where we get ripsawed on this, if you happen to do highway projects like I've done a couple of times, is that we say, well, we're going to set the CAFE standards, and they're going to come into place in 2013. And then we get to 2012, and we say, oh, well, we're going to relax them to 2016. And then we never go back and look and say, well, what's the air quality impact of that, or anything else like that, because we've already made the decision. But, of course, we blow the forecast right out of the water because we never did that. Another thing that happens a lot is that we just have methodological problems. And this is a people problem in that people's behavior has this annoying tendency to change faster than our models do. So if you spend a fair amount of time building these brilliant models that you're seeing during this seminar, and you get a bunch of graduate students working along trying to help you build this thing, and they invest several years doing it, and you've got a model that runs and takes a fair amount of data and time to do so, then you've got a relatively inflexible analytical environment that does not change very quickly, because you've got to go code diving and everything else in there and collect new data in order to capture that. And so a lot of times the methodologies that we come up with are rather rigid and inflexible, and they don't capture things like discontinuities very well at all. Like telecommuting completely beat the crap out of everyone's models because they had no way of looking at who stays home for one day during the week and what that's going to do with stuff. And then we have irrational behavior. If you get into modeling, and for those of you that don't, you can kind of gloss over this, but when you get into modeling, we approach this from a microeconomic standpoint where we say, everyone out there is a rational decision maker, and they aggressively minimize their cost. And they have perfect knowledge of all the alternatives open to them and how much all those alternatives cost. So you go in and you make a change like the Central Express like we did, and we say, oh, well, travel time has decreased, everyone's utility has gone up, ergo, people are going to use that. But there are a lot of people that don't make a decision simply based on, oh, my total time from downtown out to the burbs is now 17 minutes instead of 15 minutes because I'm not traveling the entire length of Central Expressway, I'm only using part of it. And there are a lot of reasons that people take suboptimal routes, preferences, because they've got to drop stuff off, things like that. People annoyingly do not behave the same way. And when prices of fuel jump up way high, people will use transit, but a lot of them will stay in their vehicle. And so it doesn't follow a nice, smooth mathematical curve like the kind that we love when we do models. And then there's poor data. Some models like UrbanSim, there's a blizzard of data that goes into that. Down at the parcel level, there's more data than you and I have time to go through and look at each piece individually. So it's data rich, but how people make decisions that live in all those parcels and stuff like that still comes from relatively small surveys of behavior. And we design these things, and there's a fair amount of error in them for reasons I'm not going to get into, but Kelly would be happy to talk you into senseless into all the things that could go wrong with these things. But the point is, once we pull all these data together, we infer behavior. And moreover, if you're looking at something that does not exist and you're trying to build a model to talk about it, like high-speed rail, say between the Bay Area of California and the LA Basin, no one's ever ridden a high-speed rail train between those two places before, at least not physically. And so as a consequence, they don't know that. And they can't really stack that up against Caltrain and Amtrak and driving and flying and everything else like that. So you have to administer what's called a stated preference survey, or an SP survey. And the bedeviling problem with that is that people never do what they say they're going to do. And so the revealed preference and the stated preference, there's a little bit of an inconsistency, which turns into a lot of mathematics in order to try to accommodate these things in our models. And if you guess wrong about that, your model does strange things. But probably, other than land use, the most amazing thing that causes these things to go wrong actually happens to be in the gray matter between your ears, what I call the wetware. If you remember when I saw you last, I told you that when we build a model, your beliefs frame everything about it. Because your beliefs lead you to make certain assumptions about how things are and how they will be in the future. Your beliefs help you define hypotheses that you test and translate into knowledge. And your beliefs also determine how you do data. And when we put all these things together, we have a model. And if the model is proven to be valid and useful for what you want it to be used for, then you can go off and you can use it in the future for forecasting of a different reality than you have right now. But you still have to make assumptions, and you still have to feed the thing data. So the way that this enters into the discussion is that there are two ways that your wetware influences models. One is what I call optimism bias. Turns out that almost everyone that does this modeling stuff happens to be an engineer or an urban planner. And both of them have a certain mindset how they are trying to improve society, how they have a vision for a better tomorrow than today, and they're eagerly trying to put together solutions to do that. And moreover, if you get most of them together, and especially the planners, and I are one, so I can say this as well, they have this bias towards transit. We believe that getting people out of automobiles and into transit is a socially, environmentally, and economically good thing. And there are a lot of reasons to believe that. But when you do believe that, when you start putting together these very sophisticated models, you find your way into your models. And so what you believe finds your way into your models. So we have this expectation that that's how the future is going to be. And accordingly, we put together models. And when the models kind of bend in that direction, and they look like they're going to do that, we look at it and say, yep, that model is good. It's moving the way we think it ought to move. And then there's this other thing that we have. It's called tunnel vision, where I'm going to look at the Columbia River crossing, for example, and I'm going to study the bejesus out of that thing, and I'm going to learn everything there is to know about the transportation system in Portland, Oregon, the people that use it, about what's going to happen if I change things on either side. And I never go and I look at other places that have built something like a Columbia River crossing elsewhere to learn lessons from what happened to them. So I get really immersed in this exercise, and I never look broader. And as a consequence, all the lessons learned from all those other projects are lost on you when you do that. And then there's this whole idea of deception, which is the intentionally cooking numbers. And the idea goes kind of like this, that most people, if they saw my beautiful creation and they could experience it, they would agree that it was worth the investment. But unfortunately, if I tell them how much it's really going to cost up front, they would never go for it, and it would never be built. And if you follow this kind of logic, you'll get to the point of saying, well, any kind of human progress, we got to take a risk and we got to go do. And so the ends justify the means mentality sort of gets people incentivized, if you will, to paint their projects in the best possible light. So when you get a bunch of project sponsors in, for rail, for example, they may say, I want the most optimistic projections. Sure, we may be uncertain about what the future is. Figure out what the most optimistic one that makes my project look the best, and that's it. That's my forecast. I'm sticking with that, and there's nothing you can do that's going to move me off of that. And it's not criminal. I don't think it's the intent to defraud, but it certainly is a mindset that you know, you get caught up in the enthusiasm for this thing. You're an advocate, and you want this thing to be because you can envision what it's going to be down the road. And that, unfortunately, happens a lot. And that's kind of my story about why these things happen. So now you might ask, so what can you do about it? Well, the single most significant thing, and the easiest thing to do, because it's under our control, is called confidence intervals. Remember I told you earlier, we run these doggone models, and we come out to some future thing and we say, that's my forecast. And if you are ever in a position where you have someone working for you, and they come in and they say, I am positive that this forecast is right and it's going to end up right here, you should fire them. Without benefits. That should be the end of them. because they don't know that, and you now know that they don't know that as well. But if, again, like I said earlier, if you look at a range of outcomes and you model all of them, and I go in and I tell Cindy, okay, here's your project, you've told me about it, let me tell you what might happen under these various ranges, you might be able to make some decision about which of these outcomes you're willing to put money on, but at least Cindy knows what the range looks like, rather than just having a number. And like I said before, if you get a bunch of people together and they can participate together in painting that future, your likelihood of you being in that future is a lot higher than having, you know, a bunch of geeks sitting in a room that don't have a very good social life and that love numbers and computers, sitting there and trying to figure out what society is going to look like 20 years hence. You with me? That's the biggest thing you can do that is going to make a difference. The second thing I tell you about is standards. In the United States, we fell victim to the very same trend that I showed you earlier that the Europeans did about building rail systems. So the Federal Transit Administration came up with a program called New Starts. And one of the things that New Starts has, it has this annoyingly rigorous process for calculating user benefits. And it's very consistent. And because they had some really ultimate geeks putting this thing together, the way they designed it, it is almost impossible to cheat or cook the numbers. If you have bad assumptions, it just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb and everything. And it's not necessarily the right or the only way to forecast rail traffic, but you have to pass a bunch of giggle tests where your assumptions have to be lucid, they have to line up, you have to have behavioral relationships in your model that make sense and line up with experience elsewhere. And in order to make this thing work, and transit advocates hate it. But as a consequence, we've cleaned up our act in the US. Now, unfortunately, no one's gone through and collected the data like they have in the Netherlands to prove it, but there are things that can be done with standards. Another thing you can do is transparency. Again, if I got all of you together and I got you to go through a Delphi process with me to help me nail down some of these assumptions, and we arrived at consensus by it, it's going to be a lot better than if I sit down and do it. And so rather than having just your modelers working up a set of forecasts where their assumptions are buried in software code or buried in input files, we bring them out and we make them very explicit in the form of Delphi processes, and we bring experts in. So again, if I'm doing Columbia River crossing, I'd look at local bankers, I'd look at business people, I'd look at environmental groups, I would look at the whole spectrum of people that are smart about Portland and the people that live in it in order to help me inform what I'm going to use for assumptions. I'm a big fan of open models. If someone can go in and examine your stuff, they can find a lot of stuff with it. And then what we've done recently in Melbourne, in Australia, is we had like a sledge fest. And we thought of trying to find a better word for this, but basically the gist is that we had this big controversial project. So you get everybody together in the room that is a critic or doesn't understand this. And you get all the modelers up front, and you duct tape them down to chairs so that they cannot escape out of the room. And so everyone gets to ask questions or bring up points about the model. And there's only three outcomes. Either the modeler knows the answer and can explain the answer, which is a minority of the time, or you say, well, geez, I don't know. We'll look at it and we'll post it on the website what the answer is. Or sometimes we look at it and we say, we should test that. And we should quantify it. And as a consequence, a lot of the criticisms, a lot of the uncertainty becomes explicit because it's voiced by the people that have uncertainty about it, and we can do something with it. And I'm really big about that. Then there's this thing that no one in modeling knows about called reference case forecasting. If you were to take maybe 10 modeling consultants randomly chosen from the profession, put them in a room and ask them to write down what reference case modeling forecasting is, they would all get it wrong. Well, maybe. I mean, most of them would get it wrong. So the story is like this. I want to build something like high-speed rail in California. Rather than studying California in great detail, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to find out what high-speed rail looks like in all the other places in the world, which happen to be in Europe and Asia. And I happen to know from talking to those people that most of the ridership on high-speed rail lines happens to come from markets within 50 miles of my stations. So I'm going to go to California, and I'm going to figure out where the stations are going to be. I'm going to find out what the population is within 50 miles of that, and I'm going to line it up, you know, with all these other systems that are out there, so that they all serve as a reference for which mine must fall into. It's not highly likely that California's high-speed rail is going to be 1/10 or 10 times what it is in other places. So this reference case forecasting puts your project into context with representative projects from other places. And lo and behold, when you use reference case forecasting, you are much more likely to be accurate in terms of your forecasting than you are if you just have what is called the inside view. I'm just looking at my one project, and I'm not really worrying about the rest of the world. Peer review panels are great, unless you stock them with all of your friends, which is bad form. Crash testing is wonderful. I like to develop models and then hire an intern and come in and say, I'll give you a bonus, and all the drinks will be on us for every time you're able to break the model. And you'd be amazed at how soon they will quickly drain your bank account, finding all these things. It's a huge, I can't say enough good things about doing that. To bring someone else in, fresh set of eyes, that asks naive questions. And they find so many things. And finally, there's model alignment, which I use in my defense work because the cost of being wrong is high. And so what the idea is, you feed them, and when you have them in this semi-lethargic, more or less submissive state, you bring them in, and you explain the problem to everyone, and then you turn them loose. And the two groups are not allowed to talk to each other. And they go up and they solve the problem, and they come back, and when we look at it, we're not so much interested in what the answer is. We were more interested in why do the answers differ. What different assumptions did they make to cause them to come up to these different things? And we learn a lot about systems that way. And so when you do stuff like that, you quickly come to the idea that, well, maybe it's better to have two relatively simple models that are run by smart people than one really elegant model that no one really understands anything about. So that's my story. I couldn't find a good XKCD comic, so I went back to my old standby of Dilbert, my favorite management theorist. If you have time and you have interest in this, two books to read. One is Mega Projects and Risks, still in circulation, about 10 years old. Brilliant writing. It takes a long time to read the book, although it's only 8 thick. Another fascinating book is by Gilovich and some friends that talk about heuristics and biases, and they talk about how we weigh uncertainty consciously and unconsciously, and how we make decisions as humans about that. And it's interesting if you're into this area, but if you're not, you can safely skip it. And with that, Kelly wants to answer every question you have, right?
Great, thank you.
Katie, did I make it? Okay.
All right, great presentation, Rick. So as per usual, ask questions, use your microphone so the people online can hear.
Okay, who's first victim? Yes, sir.
So a few weeks ago, we had a speaker that talked about integrated models, and one of his points was that the value of using those was it makes the process less political and more objective. Like, for example, integrating a land use model and a transportation model. I'm wondering what your take is on that, if you would agree, or if you would say that that actually introduces more uncertainty and more risk into the process.
It's a double-edged sword. Where it really helps out a lot is one of the places we go most wrong in travel forecasting is having the wrong economic inputs. And especially down at the local level, a lot of people like to have growth forecasts that are very rosy and optimistic in terms of jobs, and especially high-tech, clean industry jobs and things like that, and it never works out that way. And as a consequence, our models are wrong. The nice thing about an integrated land use model that comes along, like PICAS or UrbanSim, is that it steps through time. And it forces internal consistency between all the assumptions. So if you assume that all these jobs are going to turn up, then it's going to have this ripple effect through the economy. And if you don't have actually an economic sector there that can support them, the model will eventually crash or something. So that's good. I like that. And it certainly has injected a lot more rigor into the process. And in fact, the statewide model here in Oregon does the same thing. It runs on PICA, so it runs through time. And it has this annoying tendency to come out to a different economic future than the state economist comes out to using, a different method. And there's all kinds of reconciliation associated with that. And I think that's a great thing. I'm not saying that the model's right. I'm just saying that the fact that there's now some discussion where there wasn't one before is great. But the problem is, with an integrated land use model, transport model, is that you introduce a whole lot more moving parts, a lot more sophistication, a lot more data, and you have the opportunity for things that are over here that weren't connected before. You make a change over here and it affects the model over here in some untoward or unexpected ways and causes the model to do things that you never really thought of before because it's not there. So you get a little bit of both. Yes, sir.
You mentioned urban sim a little bit, and I was wondering if you think, you talked about like bad software and stuff like that, do you think that there's an opportunity in moving to open source software so that it can be more easily like peer reviewed and that people can check the code, that there's like opportunity moving to the future, like relying more on that than just like closed solutions?
I'm a huge fan of that. I do not believe, and this is just my personal opinion, and my employer will beat on me if you were to rat on me for saying this, but I do not believe that you should be making any public decision, especially big policy decisions, based on closed software. It's unconscionable to do that. That's the only thing I can say about it. Politically incorrect. Yes, sir.
You anecdotally mentioned in the Texas model how you didn't account for, I guess, smartphones or cell phones or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And that sort of made me think that cell phones, being as commonplace as they are, they have tons of hard sensors built into them. They have GPS, they have accelerometers and whatnot. And I was wondering if that could actually be a positive, if the data collection, that these devices are doing on a daily basis, even in the background, if that could be used to make models better, something like that.
Maybe. I talked a little bit about this when I saw you guys last, and the example I gave was in the San Francisco Bay Area, where Google is sitting and looking at cell phone tracks, and they have a blizzard of data. They have so much data that they have to use this distributed database called Hadoop just to store it all, and it's a chore trying to pull any kind of patterns out of it. And so we're not smart enough yet to mine those data to pull that stuff out of it. But yes, that is the wave of the future and how we understand things, because I would rather understand. And if I could have software or heuristics that could pull it out, I'd rather understand a little bit about a lot of people than a lot about a few people that I'm not sure are really representative of the entire population. So yeah, I'm totally there. It's where we're going. Yes, sir.
Some of the cell phone users. Okay. Some of the people watching online, I think, are crying right now. They seem to have given up all hope. The questions have in common the following. If there's all this uncertainty and the errors that multiply, is there a maximum project size that you can model? Does your ability to forecast sort of peter out as the project gets bigger?
No, there are as many examples of projects that have been successfully forecasted as there are failures. But the fact that there are some that are successful doesn't detach from or walk away from the fact that a lot of them are not right. And all of them need to be right if we're going to have an optimal use of capital and social benefit. And for the sums of money we're talking about, we can't afford to have 25, 33, whatever % of these things wrong and still be efficiently doing things. So no, I don't think so. You look at things outside of transportation, like the Apollo program had a remarkably accurate forecast. The Nautilus program, Hyman Rickover, had a remarkable, way of doing things. CityLink in Melbourne, which is close to where I grew up, was actually a private consortium that built something every bit as ambitious as the Channel. But it was a completely different business model. It was operated as a concession. And they came in on time and on cost. You know, so there are a lot of examples out there. The problem is that we're not learning from those examples, and we're not taking a lot of these ways that we could use outside information and bring it in, as well as exposing what we do and we don't know in our current models. What's your other question? And who's crying?
One of the other questions is, have you seen successful models of public involvement? You described the Sledge Fest.
Yeah.
Are there other models of using public involvement to enhance the quality of the modeling process or its outcomes?
You see them all over the place. I can't think of anything that's a raging success. One of the earliest successes was the loot track here in Portland, where we sought to develop objective and credible measures of looking at the interactions between land use and some of the things. Heavy participation, heavily influenced the whole direction of the project. I think the same thing is happening, or did happen, with least cost planning up in Seattle, where I guess this is on the internet. I should not say this, but they could have done a lot worse than they did had they not had really heavy, active public involvement. And I think that you see a lot of projects here, like Columbia River Crossing, had a fair amount of controversy associated with it. And in the end, I'm not sure that the forecast changed all that much, but a lot of forecasters went back and they had to re-examine why they made the decisions they did, and I think that was very healthy for the public in going through and doing that. But I see the trend as being more open. It used to be in the past it was really easy to hide. Now with the internet, there's really no good reason why your stuff can't be open and accessible. And there's no reason why the friction of participation has not decreased. You just can't make a straight-faced explanation for why you can't do that anymore. And if public credibility and investor credibility is going to be maintained in building big infrastructure and rebuilding our cities and stuff like that, it's going to have to be. So I can't see it doing anything other than being more open and participatory. But I'm a dreamer. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Do you ever build models like where you factor in the uncertainty and then just run them like 100 or 1,000 times to get a spread? I know some models take so long to run that would be impractical. But.
Yes. A lot of times, you run into two problems. Number one, you run out of time to do that. Number two, occasionally in the political process, you run into people that say, I don't want that. I understand what you're saying about uncertainty, but I don't mind knowing about uncertainty as a project sponsor, but the last thing I want is that uncertainty to leak out to the public, because they'll look at it and say, well, I don't know what to think about this project. When in fact that's probably what should happen, but on the other hand, you know, that doesn't happen a lot. But yes, it's common. It's becoming more common. And this is one thing I'm really excited about in cloud computing. Even if you have these really complicated models like UrbanSim, it used to be that if you wanted to run them 50 times, you'd have to have 50 machines. So Cindy could run, you know, a model a lot of times because they got this huge honking cluster of computers at Metro. But most places they couldn't do that. But now with the cloud, you should be able to spin up 50 instances of your model on Amazon EC2, run it, and collate the results and look at it, and it cost you close to nothing. You didn't have to buy anything to do it, except for the machine time. It's going to change the way we do business in a big way, and for the better. Anybody else? You guys are as equally happy to get to lunch as I am, I can see. Oh, no. More crying?
Competing with some sunshine here today.
That's okay. I'm happy to lose out to that.
Well, let's thank Rick for a great, interesting discussion, great presentation and discussion. Next week, I believe we have Jarrett Walker, who's here to talk about human transport. And then the following week, we'll pick up again with our modeling topic with Brian Greger to talk a little bit about the greenhouse gas modeling efforts here in Oregon. Again, if you could bring your questions up to me, even if you were lucky enough to ask it here in the seminar, and put your name on it and the date. Thanks.